So thanks for everyone for joining. Today we're joined by Belu de Arbelaiz and Michael McLaughlin, and we're going to be talking about cyber recovery for VMware Cloud Foundation. We're going to be touching on a lot of hot topics, including why ransomware is a big issue and how recovery is the critical line of last defense for that. Talking about how live recovery and private cloud, and doing some technical deep dives on all of the above. So be sure to have your questions ready to go. We've also got Yumi Hong in the chat ready to answer your questions live. So don't hesitate to chip in with any questions you might have. So coming up here pretty soon, our next session is coming up next week. We're going to be doing automated self-recovery and delivery and management of infrastructure and app services with VMware Cloud Foundation. And some of our technical marketing team, Tim George and Vincent Riccio, will be joining us. That's coming up next week on the 24th. May 8th, explore the value of VMware Cloud Foundation in the healthcare provider market. So really good content germane to that vertical. And we'll have Brianne Buell and Ray Malo in there. And then up on the 15th, we'll have Accelerate Operations and Lower Costs with High Performance Storage and VMware Cloud Foundation with Tom Nagelmeyer. So that'll be another great one.
My name is Belu de Arbelaiz. I am a product marketing engineer for VMware Cloud Foundation, and I am primarily focused on our data protection, cyber, and disaster recovery as it applies to VMware Cloud Foundation. So there are a couple of things that we're going to cover today. We're going to understand a little bit how cyber recovery is different from DR, what unique challenges it presents, and we're also going to do a technical deep dive into how this works, right? How this applies to our VMware Cloud Foundation platform. So with me, I have Mike McLaughlin, who is going to be in charge of the technical deep dive once we do the overview. So Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello, thanks, Belu. Yeah, I'll be joining in a little bit later to deep dive into the product, and I'm also with the VMware Cloud Foundation team focusing on the protection aspects, and I'll be joining the session just a little bit later on.
Sounds good. So with that, let's kick off this conversation. First of all, I think it's important that we set the stage in terms of, debunking a few misconceptions that, are out there today in terms of, having backup, DR, how that applies to cyber recovery, and dive a little deeper into what organizations are actually doing today for cyber recovery and how and why this is a different use case from traditional DR, even if DR is foundational to cyber recovery. So, in terms of the customer challenges, as we talk to our customers, what we have seen is that the vast majority of them already have a backup and DR solution in place, right? But the key question is here, what about cyber recovery, right? What about this very pressing use case that has become top of mind for C-suite executives, board members, IT practitioners, and this does seem like an important problem that many organizations are ill-equipped to address. So let's dive a little deeper into what this means. The first thing we have seen, and we will want some of your input here towards the end of the session on this, is that many organizations don't have a very high confidence in their ability to recover, right? So this is partly tied to the fact that most organizations don't test their recovery plans as often as they should. So when the time comes, they need to recover. There's an issue with a cyber attack or other, disruption, and they kind of have to stitch all the different pieces together when there is, this really high pressure to be able to recover these applications. All of this to say that cyber recovery is different from DR, right? It does present a set of unique challenges. The first challenge is related to the way recovery points are selected. So in a traditional DR scenario, what you would probably do if you have a power outage or a hardware failure, you would just pick your latest backup and recover your data from there, right? Because why would you pick a previous backup if there hasn't been any data corruption or encryption? Now, in cyber recovery, picking the latest recovery point is actually, in the majority of cases, not an option, right? Because cyber attacks do have dwell times that they actually use to infiltrate different systems within the infrastructure. They move laterally. So this is actually the process of selecting these recovery points is a non-trivial task, right? So IT teams are usually left with an ocean of recovery points and no clear guidance as to where to start. So once these recovery points have been identified, the next step is to actually validate these restore points. Essentially, make sure they're free of malware, make sure they're clean. And in order to be able to do that, we need an isolated, safe, quarantined environment that is separate from production, where we can actually safely run all these tests across these recovery points, which could potentially be infected. So essentially, we have to create what we call an isolated recovery environment, or you'll also hear me say IRE. This is a common industry term that many of you are probably familiar with, but essentially this testing happens within the bounds of this isolated recovery environment. In addition, once we bring these workloads and power them on in the isolated recovery environment, we do need to isolate these VMs from one another. The key reason for this is that cyber attacks, as I mentioned, move laterally, right? So if we power on a workload that's infected in the IRE, what will likely happen is that this infection will pass over to adjacent VMs, right? And then the consequences of that are, longer times to recovery. You can actually reinfect the production environment and cause additional damage. So it is very important to bear in mind that these VMs not only need to be tested in a safe environment, but also need to be isolated from one another. And then finally, how do we do all of this at a scale that supports the needs of the business, right? This is not going to be done on a per VM basis, especially if your infrastructure is huge, like many of your organizations probably is. So we do need to find a way to orchestrate all of these different steps to be able to essentially be able to recover, meeting the SLAs that the organization needs. A key thing to highlight here is related to the way we validate these restore points, right? In this isolated recovery environment I just mentioned. So with the traditional approach, right? So back in the day, the way this was done is by essentially grabbing a backup snapshot and running a signature scan on that workload, an offline signature scan, right? Now, the problem with that is that, that's great to identify a malicious file and then delete it and then move forward, right? But there has been a paradigm shift in the way cyber threats operate. So starting in 2017, what we have seen is that the majority of cyber threats leverage fileless techniques. So what this means essentially is that they work in memory, they will leave no trace, no file behind, they will leverage legitimate tools and processes to spread throughout the infrastructure. So if you run an offline scan on a workload that has a fileless ransomware strain within it, you will not be able to spot it, right? The test will come out clean. So this creates the need for additional methods for us to be able to confidently identify these fileless threats, which according to CrowdStrike research, for example, represent over 70% of attacks today. So the only way that we can actually confidently identify these threats is by doing what we call a behavioral analysis. This requires us to power the workload on in the isolated recovery environment and run this analysis to understand how the data behaves over time. This will allow us to spot malicious activity, which will indicate the presence of a threat within the workload. more on that later because I'm sure Mike is going to touch on that concept and go deeper. And then finally, another challenge that we see when we talk to our customers is that given all these different pieces that need to be integrated, right? You need the restore point selection, you need the behavioral analysis, you need the next gen AV because some cyber threats will be file-based. You need to orchestrate this entire process. You need to provision the isolated recovery environment. So this results in a very siloed approach to the cyber recovery operation, right? People are just trying to manually stitch together separate solutions from separate vendors. And this has a direct impact not only in the effectiveness of the recovery process, but also in the amount of IT resources that need to be dedicated to the operation and inevitably the total cost of ownership. So all this to say that the traditional backup and DR approach is not enough to recover from these modern cyber threats. So before we move on, I would like to open this up to the audience and actually ask you two key questions based on what we just covered. The first question in the poll is related to how often do you folks or do your organizations test their cyber and recovery plans? So I think there should be a poll coming up on your screens, and we just need to know, is it more than once a year or not? So that is one of the first questions.
So yeah, we've got the first round of the poll is up. And it's looking like of everybody, of all of our respondents, got a lot of active people online here. It's looking like about 53% said yes, which is actually a pretty impressive number.
Yeah, that is really good, guys.
Super good. And so we got the second poll questions up and running now about cyber attack being cyber attacks a concern for people's organization or if they have been in the past. And those numbers are still coming in. We'll give you another couple seconds here.
Well, it's good that you folks are testing, right? The recommended frequency of testing is usually around once a quarter. But you know, anything that is more frequent than once a year is a huge step forward.
So wrapping up that second question, it's looking like we've got more than half of the people voted here, and we're looking at about 80% folks say that cyber attacks are a legitimate concern for them.
Well, guys, this is what we're here to talk about today. So
that's a big
thing. Yeah, hopefully you will leave this session with, you know, a really good understanding of, you know, how we can actually address this problem, right? That there is a way to fix this.
So that gets us to the how. How is VMware and VCF addressing a lot of these unique challenges that folks are dealing with in cyber recovery?
Absolutely. That brings me to my next slide. So essentially, the way VMware is helping our customers enforce and implement this confident, strong cyber and data resiliency across their infrastructure is by bringing together the power of proven VMware technologies to deliver this unified experience that extends across cyber recovery as a service, disaster recovery as a service, and on-premises disaster recovery. So this essentially allows our customers to extend their on-premises DR operations to the cloud, right? Some people might want to still use their secondary data center because they need to amortize that infrastructure, or they might have compliance requirements, or they may need, you know, 1 minute RPOs or any, you know, specific considerations to on-premises, right? But we do allow for this extension and this gradual transition from one topology to the other. So in terms of, you know, the confident recovery that this product delivers, right? A few things come to mind in terms of what we were just discussing. So we'll have behavior analysis, we'll have the IRE, will have the isolation of VMs. And of course, all of these snapshots are immutable and air-gapped, which is actually kind of table stakes at this point for cyber recovery. But I do want to show you guys a little bit more about how this actually works, right? So essentially what we have here is a production site, and this applies specifically to the cyber and disaster recovery as a service use case. So you will have your production site, your VMware Cloud Foundation production site can be on premises or in the cloud. And the first step that's going to happen is you're going to replicate these workloads, which are going to be stored in the scale-out cloud file system, which is a part of VMware Live Recovery. So essentially, what happens next is that in the event of a traditional disaster, and this is the disaster recovery as a service use case, these workloads are brought up in this isolated recovery environment, which is also a VCF environment. So essentially, you are able to fail over these workloads. And the good thing about this is that unlike other solutions that do require you to have this idle infrastructure that's working at all times, we allow you to provision this isolated recovery environment either on demand, or if you have, more stringent RTO requirements and don't really want to wait for this cloud SDDC to provision, you can also deploy it in a pilot-like form, right? So you will deploy 2 or 3 hosts of failover capacity, which can then be scaled. In both cases, this does provide significant TCO benefits, primarily because you're just not maintaining, securing and, managing this idle infrastructure at all times. So then, a process most of you already know probably is the failback. Essentially, we do delta-based failback, so only the change blocks of data get back to the production site. And that kind of completes the DRAS use case. But let's jump into what I think most of you are interested in, which is the ransomware recovery as a service use case. So imagine your production site gets hit with ransomware, right? Essentially, as I mentioned, we do have this immutable air-gapped storage within the cloud file system of VMware Live Recovery. So the first step in being able to conduct a ransomware recovery operation is going to be to invoke this dedicated workflow that VMware Live Recovery includes. Essentially, this workflow will span across identification, validation, and restore of recovery points at scale. And it includes a series of capabilities that I'm going to walk through now, which are highly differentiated and really do show how this product provides strong value to our customers. So first of all, you will spin up this isolated recovery environment if you chose not to do it through Pilot Lite. This IRE can be provisioned directly from the Cloud Console. This is not something that you need to manually create, secure, manage, and all those kind of cumbersome steps when actually deploying this IRE. So this is made easy for you through the Cloud Console. And then the first thing you're going to do is you're going to invoke a feature called guided restore point selection, which essentially is going to provide insights into the different snapshots, such as VMDK rate of change, file entropy, metrics that actually help you measure the compressibility of the data within the snapshot, right? And Mike is going to cover that in more detail in subsequent slides, so I'm not going to dwell too much on it. So essentially, once you've identified these recovery point candidates, you are going to power them on in this quarantined environment that we've created, right? And here's where the magic steps in, right? So what we've done is we have embedded this behavioral analysis that is needed to identify these modern strains of ransomware into the workflow. Right, so you will power on the workload, you will run the behavioral analysis as well as a next-gen AV and vulnerability analysis, right, because we want to cover all bases. And essentially, that will allow you to determine whether the workload is clean or not. A nice thing about this is that infrastructure and security teams can actually seamlessly collaborate, right? There's features such as recovery point badging, and other interesting things that can actually help integrate these two teams' operations during the recovery process. And then an important thing that I didn't touch upon before is like, what happens if you bring up a workload in the IRE and that workload is not good, right? You need to be able to do this rapid iterative process of recovery points in the IRE, because that's what essentially it is going to enable you to quickly find these clean restore points to eventually bring back to the production site. Finally, an important thing to highlight here is that it is fairly common that your production site will be unavailable for a certain period of time, right? Because you will probably have to bring in law enforcement agencies, there's going to be forensics happening, you're going to have to fortify, remediate the threat within the production site. So for those cases, we do support our customers continuing to run their workloads in the cloud until the production site is ready to bring them back. So one more thing I wanted to tie into this before I hand it over to Mike is, so we are talking about cyber recovery, right? But cyber recovery is actually part of a bigger thing, which is cyber resilience, right? So how is VMware thinking about cyber resilience, and how does this tie into the broader VMware Cloud Foundation value proposition? So what you'll see here is that there are different layers of protection, right? You will have the preventative measures, which are of course needed and extremely important. These are mechanisms that are either implemented into the infrastructure, such as hardening, to actually, prevent attackers from initially coming in. We do offer this out-of-the-box hardened infrastructure with VMware Cloud Foundation. There's, several unique features, including the automated centralized patching, strong identity federation and management of security controls, encryption of data at rest and in transit. And we also offer something that is directly baked into the infrastructure, which is the compliance monitoring, right? This will allow you to identify any compliance drifts and auto remediate them. Another thing you'll be able to do is to have adaptable security and network policies across applications, right? So as these applications change, these security and networking policies go with them, right? So you don't have any stale firewall policies that could eventually compromise your network and cause an outage. Now, the next level of protection is related to this advanced threat prevention, right? How do we manage our east-west security to be able to initially prevent the attack, but if it does come in, have a reliable way to identify and contain it? So this is a key part of the ransomware defense. And essentially what we deliver is, the advanced firewall, right? So the micro-segmentation that is going to protect your environment. We monitor all east-west traffic. We use IDS, IPS, and network traffic analysis to do detection, both based on signatures and behavior. And the IDS also plays a role in helping you prevent data exfiltration. And we also have malware prevention for zero-day detection. And then finally, the way VMware Live Recovery comes in as this last line of defense, right? It really complements these other two very important concepts. And it does deliver this purpose-built capabilities that are dedicated, right, to enable this confident, quick recovery at scale. So I have not been looking at the chat, but I'm sure there are probably a few questions that are being addressed. But with that, I would love to hand it over to Mike to do the technical deep dive.
Awesome. Well, got Mike moving over here to presenter mode. So, hey, Mike, how does this all come together in the product? Can you give us a sort of an example of how the capabilities in the live recovery work?
Yeah, that's actually what we're going to dig into here. Belu, you covered a lot of really good points, and I'm going to elaborate a little bit on that with a little bit more of a show and tell. I have a combination here of a little bit of some PowerPoint and some live product. So we're going to do a little bit deeper dive into the technical aspects and then a few demos along the way. And I may switch back and forth as we go through this.
Yeah, perfect.
So one of the things is VMware Live Recovery is the encompassing umbrella, and we're going to focus on ransomware recovery because that's the title of today's session. And for the next 20 plus minutes, let's focus in on this piece down here, the cyber recovery, ransomware recovery use case of VMware Live Recovery. All right. And I'm going to go back and forth between this workflow and the product as we sort of peel back the layers and dig into some of the details. So one of the first things, and I don't know if you actually said a sea of snapshots, but I do like that analogy, is if you're protecting your environment, from a disaster recovery perspective, the latest, greatest is what you want to fail over operations for. And you're going to fail those over to your other recovery site and get back into business. Ransomware recovery is a little bit different. And that partly is due to the dwell time and the nature of the attack. And so we have the ability here with the cyber recovery solution to deepen that recovery point safety net. Now I've highlighted here, monthly snapshots for 4 months. And I'm not ever suggesting you roll your business back 4 months and start over. But what we're saying here is having sufficient recovery points at the RPO levels that you need and at the duration and retention that you need to sift back through some of the problems and make sure minimize data loss is what we're looking at here. And having additional recovery points that go back in time. Because the question I'm going to ask in any situation is like, how did you feel on Friday? Oh, not so good. How about Thursday? How about the week before? Let's find out when this happened actually, and let's get you healthy again. So having snapshot retention is really critical. But this does create a little bit of challenge, and we'll see that a little bit further in the workflow here. The other thing that we brought up was this notion of an isolated recovery environment. All right, we're going to call that our recovery SDDC, software defined data center. It's a VCF terminology here. And in this case, I'm going to go ahead and deploy one. I'm going to add a recovery SDDC. And this takes a couple of hours, but it can be done on the fly if necessary or expanded relatively quickly using the cloud-based resources. But more interesting enough, that isolated recovery environment that you're going to use to do the remediation and validation work has a couple of things built into it. One of the first things we do is we instrument that recovery site with the necessary NGAV, next-gen antivirus tools to do the proper behavioral analysis of those workloads that we're going to bring up in there. The other thing that we do is we also, if we open this up with a slightly different view, is we're going to leverage some of the VMware NSX capabilities. And everyone's probably familiar with firewalls and microsegmentation and a number of things from a security perspective, but being able to do that quickly on the fly in predefined fashion, we're going to instrument the environment, and you'll see that this comes in very handy later as we start to go through the behavioral analysis and the validation of the workloads. So the SDDC that we're creating, our recovery environment, our isolated recovery environment, is already set up for us with some key components as part of the as a service that Belu had mentioned of this overall solution here. The other thing that's kind of interesting is from a disaster recovery versus a cyber recovery perspective. Disaster recovery is much more of a run book. Operations are down and we have a place to go do business. Cyber recovery or ransomware recovery is a little bit more iterative and has a number of other intermediate steps in it. Now, there are some that are workflow states that we've identified. So we go basically from backup on the left to healthy and recovered on the right. And in between, we're going to have these workflow states and actually some transitional states and our inventory moving below us here that we're going to want to be able to sort and separate and allocate and divide and conquer and track throughout the recovery process. This is one of the things that makes the ransomware recovery or a cyber attack recovery so much different than disaster recovery. We are trying to get back to a state of healthy workloads, healthy virtual machines, and they're going to be in a number of different states as we go through that with our infrastructure team and our security team. All right. And so let's just take a moment and switch over. I want to kind of share this out in a moment here. So at the top level, VMware Live Recovery has these capabilities, and we're going to look at the cyber recovery capability here. And I have a live environment that's been running for a while. It's protecting a number of data center sites to my cloud file system. And I have my disaster recovery SDDC that I'm using as an IRE. It's already provisioned. So I saved us about 2 hours of waiting for something to provision in the cloud, but it's ready up and ready and running and already configured for me. I also have in my cloud file system, that sea of snapshots I talked about, there's over 8,000 snapshots in total VM snapshots in this environment in multiple protection groups. So my environment is protected with policies based on the importance or criteria that I've established in my environment. So I have a nice granularity here and in various shapes and forms. And almost all of these that are part of my ransomware recovery framework have at least 3 to 4 months of retention sitting behind them. Or I would get a notice from my compliance check, which gives me a kind of a nice feeling that things are set up here. Now, my recovery plans, and I actually have one ready for us here, up and running. This one has, I don't know, 16 or so VMs in it. Some of them are still in backup. Some of them are already in validation, and we can see their status down here, and we'll take a quick look at that one in just a moment. I've already staged a few of these for recovery, and just for demonstration today, because we have a limited amount of time, I've already recovered one. So I want you to see what the workflow and the product looks like as I go through these steps. All right, now before I jump back into the next thing here, let's go back and take a look at our overall workflow and picking the snapshot. Now, one of the things that we're doing as we protect the data in your production site, in your VCF environment, we're taking a snapshot, we're taking that data, we're moving it offsite into the cloud, in basically so that it's safe. But we're also looking at some interesting data here. And if you look, my snapshot timeline across the top here also has change rate and entropy data, which is basically the compressibility of the data that is in that snapshot being tracked for us over that time. All right, and so we can see here, for example, just quick visually, that there's something that happened here, and in this example is back in November, that was a little different along the timeline. And if I can't explain that, or my application team or my infrastructure team can't say, oh, that's when we were doing this to the environment, we were doing patches, upgrades, migrate, whatever, that is a possible point in time we need to be worried about when things started to go wrong. That might have been when the health of the environment was becoming at risk. And so moving a little bit to the left of that might be where we want to start our recovery process. Anything further to the left, obviously, is going to be more data loss. Anything to the right could be higher risk. But we're getting this snapshot data about what's going on in our environment. Now, I don't know exactly what happened there, we could, and I'm glad most of you are testing your environments, because we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But this lets me get through picking snapshots that make sense for the recovery task at hand. And that's why I want to have that deeper archive of recovery points. Okay. And then I can just pick one and start it in my recovery SDDC. Let's flip back to the environment here for a moment and take a quick look. So if I pick something down here that's in backup, like server 1, I could say, let's go ahead and start that in our recovery environment, and I'll get an analysis here of all of the snapshots that I have. Now, I'm just going to use this for demonstration purposes, but notice here, somewhere along the, several days ago, actually, I looked at this environment. I was doing some testing, preparation for today's demo, and I noticed something that I wasn't comfortable with this particular snapshot, and I've tagged it. So I can actually do this in some of my proactive use of this environment. Now, I didn't fail it over, I didn't fail it back. I'm just looking along at something I didn't like, or maybe needs work, and I've marked it there. So we're over here, 2 days later, and you can see that I have snapshots going well back into the past. So this gives me this ability to basically run over the inventory that I'm working with. All right. So let's go back here for a second. Now that you kind of see how that works, we're going to look a little bit more at what happens when they get brought into inventory. So once I start that virtual machine, I pick a snapshot, I bring it into the environment. We're going to instrument it with next-gen antivirus tools, and we're going to begin 3 basic, very important validation steps. And I've highlighted them here in the middle. The vulnerability analysis, we're going to basically scan through looking for known, think of this as a CVEs or patches. We're looking at the application. Now, this virtual machine is up and running, so we can interrogate it much more deeply than just a static scan of its file system. We're going to do that too. The malware signature scan. We're going to look for the obvious things that might have worked their way in. But the third one there, the behavioral analysis, begins. And we have a set of rules that are customizable that are looking at what that virtual machine application workload is doing while it's running. So is it reaching out to IP addresses that you do not want? Is it changing privileges inside of its own infrastructure? Is it waiting on, you can basically look for behavior that you do not want and let that run for some period of time and look for those aberrant behaviors and then figure out what to do about it. All right, and that's really the key here. So if we switch back over to our environment, our live environment here, let me just close out of this screen for a moment. Bear with me. Let me just drill back down in here. If I look at my recovery plan that's running here, and I have one like this app 05 with a vulnerability risk on it, all right? Now, the scans have been done. This has been running for a couple of hours. I started this up this morning, like I said, in preparation for today. This is a great example, but there's also critical vulnerabilities that I can look at in this interface, all right? And if I recognize these might be things I have to patch, things I didn't know were happening. I pick any one of these, I get more details, and I can also leverage in my security console and my security team. So if I know that this is something I can't fix or I do not want in this virtual machine, I may want to iterate and pick a different snapshot or bring the security team in and ask what to do about these alerts. All right, if there were actually behavioral problems, they would show up here. And that might not happen immediately. It might require a little bit more of this validation process. And that's why we have this workflow helping us through the entire progress of the system. So flip back over for a moment. So this is our evaluation phase here. And if we look, we've already seen we can go here and operate, pick these out, bring in our security team. But at the end of this, and I kind of want to make sure we get through a whole process here so you can understand what's in the tool. We're not going to solve any one specific problem here. But from this dashboard, all right, I can now finish the inspection. Once I'm satisfied with all of that, we also have guest file restore capabilities, so I can reach into any one of those snapshots and pull other files or folders out to place them in this virtual machine's inventory. All right, reducing data, minimizing data loss is one of our key tenets here. All right, I can also change the isolation. Now, if you remember, I showed you that the isolated recovery environment was instrumented with NSX networking features. And we built in some predefined firewall rules. These are on a per VM basis, and these are the simple ones that we've included. And you can see you can create custom ones here as well if you want. But this essentially says we're going to start this workload safely in a quarantined plus analysis stage, what it's doing right now. But I'm free to open up its access outward, inward, left and right. So I can do east, west, north, south. I can basically open up the access to this workload. And that in itself might trigger some behaviors or cause something else in the environment to suddenly interact. And then I got to mitigate both of those. And so this is going to give me the ability to, once I've identified what it is I'm going after, how to safely bring it online, bring it into analysis, and manage its behavior as I get it ready for return to service. So in this case, I might want to change its isolation level. Up in the right-hand corner, I just highlighted the setting the badge, that one that I showed you on the timeline earlier. If I don't like what I see here, or I do like what I see here, I can mark this for the rest of my team to see. All right, and at the end of this whole validation process, this is what we want to get to, is go through all of this work, behavioral analysis, remediation, isolation control, all of these things. But eventually, I want to power off and stage this virtual machine point in time for eventual recovery. So I'll go ahead and do that. And that's where we get back to kind of looking at things here. If I go back to my plan, I have some that are already staged, some that have gone into a recovered state. And for any of these, I can come through here and pick multiple systems. I can sort by the protection policy that they use, the state that they're in. So from a scalability perspective, I could be dealing with literally dozens to hundreds of virtual machines that are moving through my recovery process with my team, or just myself, depending, and sort through this so that I can manage this at scale and apply the necessary activities and tasks to get them to this final recovered state. All right, and so we come back here one last time. In this final stage here, all right, we're essentially going to recover this into our protected site, bring it back home, so to speak, and we've got to acknowledge that we're going to replace the one that we were working on. So the one that was in the original production site that was affected has now been brought into the IRE, gone through the remediation process, the cleansing process, the validation process, staged, and now basically can be recovered back into the production site so that I have a final clean, final state virtual machine of my inventory. Now that's the general workflow. That's kind of peeling back a lot of things that Belu talked about, being able to select the right snapshot, validate that point in time, iterate on that, manage isolation control, validate it with next-gen antivirus tools, and go through all of this at scale. All right, and I know that we kind of went quickly through this. We're doing this in a very short, compressed time frame. So let's switch back over here for just a moment, because what I want to do is I've walked through this process in a demo that I have that I want to share with you that kind of leaves you with the whole workflow that we just talked about one more time from start to finish. So let's take a look. So we're going to start here in our cyber recovery dashboard. I have a recovery plan already defined, and in this case, W2K16 App 1. Keep an eye on that one. That's what we're looking for. It's in our apps recovery plan. We have it set up. It's nicely validated, the compliance checks. We could do DR, test, failover, but I can also do a ransomware recovery here. All right, and in this case, I'm going to start the ransomware recovery, and there's W2K16 App 1. Notice that it's in backup still. So let's pick this one. Start it in our recovery SDDC. I'm going to pick a known good point in the past to begin the process of this demo, and you'll see that it'll basically instrument and get things running here. If for some reason I'm feeling risky, I might want to try a different snapshot just a little further. Now, this badge got in here because I've been doing my homework. For this demo, for this environment here, I know that this is not a good one, so let's go somewhere in between. Pick a new recovery point, try a different snapshot, iterate through that sea of snapshots. I'm going to keep a couple of notes here on the screen to myself, and we're going to go through and basically do the same process of instrumenting it. In this case, let's just say that I'm happy. I'm going to go ahead and badge this one as verified so that I can communicate to the rest of the team that this particular virtual machine point in time is ready to go. I can scroll down here, and one last thing, and maybe I should have done this first, but I like doing this, is going in and saying, well, let's mark this to allow internal inbound. I'm going to send this over now to my security team to test. They're going to access this virtual machine. They're going to say, yes, it looks good. All right, I'm going to change that isolation. That's changing all of the per VM firewall rules with a push of a button. All right, if everything, and behavioral analysis is still running. If everything is good, this is an excellent candidate to basically then close down the validation steps, kind of clean up the screen here a little bit, and power off and stage. And I'm going to take a new staging snapshot, keeping any of the changes that I did during that remediation process, and power that off and stage it. And it's going to move down the workflow, and now I can recover that into my protected site, knowing that I'm going to replace the one that's there, and that these take a little bit longer than the click-through I'm doing right here, because we're doing tasks that could take literally minutes to possibly hours, depending on the scale of the environment. But we're working through an orderly process from backup through validation to staging to recovered in a fairly organized and controlled environment that's giving me all of the things that I need to deal with a cyber recovery versus just what I would say a traditional site disaster recovery, pull out the run book, grab the latest and greatest backup, and switch to the other site. This gets a little bit different because I have to basically work through using my IRE to do the remediation of all of the backups that are in my cloud file system from the protected sites that I've already set up in my cyber recovery solution. And with that, I have my recovery plans here, and we can come back into this one and continue to work if we want to. Or I think what I'll do at this point is switch back and see if there's any questions, or just kind of do a general quick overview highlight of what we've seen here, what makes this so different than the other solutions out on the market for ransomware or cyber attack recovery. All right. So I've walked through the workflow here. Let me just take a look and see if there's any questions. The other thing to keep in mind is much of what we showed you here today, and Belu had pointed out a few things, the as-a-service nature. All right, a lot of the things that were set up for you in this demonstration and this technical walkthrough were set up in facilities managed by VMware. So the isolated recovery environment, the offsite backups to the cloud file system. A couple of things that we put into the environment to enable that are also managed remotely from the ransomware recovery capabilities of VMware Live Cyber Recovery. And that kind of wraps up what I'd like to share with you. I'm happy to go back and touch on anything that might be a question, or just open it up for general questions to the audience here.
Yeah, we got a ton of questions, and Yumi's been tackling a lot of them. Let me see if there's anything that's still outstanding here. One of the ones is what changes have been made to remove the performance implications of old snapshots? Their current policy is to remove snapshots after 72 hours. How is Live Recovery different from that?
So you're probably talking about snapshots that are on the production site. And so one of the things that we're doing is we're taking a snapshot of the data, picking up the change blocks, moving those offsite to the cloud file system, and then removing the snapshot in the production environment. So only during that moment of backup and transport will there be possibly any impact on the production site from sort of the vSphere, vCenter perspective. All right, and so that's one of the optimizations that you'll see in the cyber recovery approach is we're not leaving a lot of snapshots laying around in the production site that we're protecting. The other thing that is really important to understand here is that the cloud file system, we're sending those snapshots over there. We're looking at the data, and we saw that in the snapshot review on the timeline there. So we're looking at the amount of data and the nature of that data so that we can give you the change rate and the entropy. But we're also constructing a complete snapshot of that virtual machine at that point in time. So one of the iterations, and when we went through going back to, and it's a long answer, sorry, we go back through each of those snapshots that's in the cloud file system, that sea of snapshots that I can pick from, they are all basically, I'll call them first-class virtual machine artifacts that can be quickly brought into inventory and powered on. And that's what makes it so easy to move back and forth on that timeline, the iteration aspect of a cyber recovery versus a site recovery. You're not going to back to the question I said, how'd you feel Friday? If you don't like that, let's move to Thursday. Let's move to Wednesday. I can do that very quickly because the snapshots are optimized in the cloud file system, and the behavior of managing those out of the production site has been optimized as well.
All right, and while we were finishing up there, we ended up running the poll on people's confidence in their ability to actually actually recover from a cyber attack, and we had 14% were high confident. Which is fantastic. 59% were medium and 27% were of low confidence. So hopefully we can do our best to assist that 27% and nudge some of those 59s into the high. So another question came in. What can you do if you? Oh, sir. Yeah.
I'd like to leave a thought for the audience. So we have this cyber recovery capability running as a service. And so maybe to raise those levels just a little bit in the future, kind of what we were doing today in the demo, I can non-disruptively take workloads and cyber recover them and let them analyze and get all of the sort of muscle memory and get those badges that I found earlier. So there's an excellent opportunity to leverage this as a proactive capability to increase that confidence that should a cyber attack actually happen, you've been through enough mock exercises to feel confident that you can pull that back.
Excellent. And we've got sort of a specific question here. What can you do if you have protected government data, since this isn't supported in GovCloud?
That's that's a tough one right now. Yes. Go ahead.
One thing I will say is that it is part of our vision to be able to support these dark sites, right? As well as go through any compliance processes that need to be done for us to support these type of applications. It is not something that is available today, but it is definitely a roadmap item that we are considering.
Awesome. And then another one here, how does Snapshot Recovery work if the VMDK files have been encrypted?
So at that point, if the VMDK files have been encrypted, you're talking about back in the on-premise, in the protected site. If we can't take the snapshot, then we're going to probably need to go to a previous version. All right. If the snapshots are still happening and the VMDKs have been encrypted internally, then we may have to pick an earlier one, or we may be able to restore those into the IRE in a state that has not been, I'll just say, ransomed yet. And that's one of the things is the data encryption, and that's why I showed you that one little bump on the curve there, is the data encryption will change the nature of the data, and we may actually see that coming through in the snapshot data and give us a point to either go back and before any encryption or before encryption has detonated. And that's one of the things you got to look at, because once you can't get into the files, that's the disaster. That's the cyber attack disaster we're trying to provide recovery from.
Right. Yeah, it looks like we've got just about all of our other questions wrapped up here. I know Yumi's been working overtime here to take care of a lot of them. So I know we were having a little bit of difficulty early on with some audio issues. Some folks weren't able to connect to the audio, and I'm guessing this is probably related to the app-related issues that killed our cameras. So we will definitely have the recording will be available. We'll socialize the recording out for everybody who's interested. A lot of questions on that, so we'll get that taken care of. So just looking real quick, I don't see any other outstanding questions that haven't already been addressed. So any parting shots from either of you before we sign off?
I'll just say, thanks all for being here to, let us share with you all these really important things about this critical use case. We are great, very happy to see interest, and please come talk to us, right? If you don't have high confidence in your ability to recover, we are here to help. So just reach out.
Definitely. All righty. So
Belu
and Mike. Oh, for sure. Absolutely. And we appreciate having you. This was probably one of our best attended sessions. So my suspicion is we're probably going to have you back for a sequel with the numbers of folks that were attending today, because the questions are still rolling in. So be great to have you back. So
Belu,
Michael, Yumi, thank you. Yes, definitely. We appreciate you being here. This is without your advice and having you accessible to our customers and other interested folks on the topic is really important to the community, and making sure that they have access to you. We appreciate your time. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
All righty, folks. Well, with that, we're gonna cut loose for today. So be sure to check up for our schedule for the sessions that we mentioned in the earlier in the show for the coming weeks, and also keep an eye out for the recordings, which will be available shortly. So with that, thanks again, and everyone have a good rest of the week. Take care.